Go on then, in for a penny, in for a pound. Yes, the flat earth does hunger for want of a map, but given that Mercator's masterpiece wasn't made until the 17th century, and even then it was only done to suit the powers that be, let's not be too harsh on those that have offered something else for the flatties amongst us. It doesn't take much of a search to find hundreds of maps that claim to show what the world looks like, but short of gathering a fleet of ships and a regiment of cartographers, you're not going to make anything amazingly different from those that are already floating around. In the first instance, and while it might not be popular to some of you who are listening to this, the first question is, do we really need a map? When was the last time you got in an aeroplane with a map and found your way to your holiday destination? Beyond having a map to get yourself to the airport and another to get you from the airport to your hotel, you don't really have a clue where you went. The pretty display on the back of the most plane seats only lends to an illusion that the world is a ball. Except for the interminable time you'll have sat on the runway waiting to take off, you spent most of the bulk of your journey up above the clouds. Okay, occasionally you may have had seen the odd speck of land, but while the bulk of intercontinental flights are over the oceans, the only other recognisable scenery you'll have seen was on the approach to the airports for what, 10 minutes? Hardly enough time to go mapping the world as you go. This really only matters for those who would like something on which to build their view of the world. No, you don't need a map, but it's a nice thing to have. Like most people, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to the mundane things of life. After all, why keep a dog and bark yourself? No, I'm not about to map the world, but between all those who've attempted to do so, there should be a fairly good idea of what's out there. So, step one is to make a great big pile of all the maps you can find and fish out the rubbish. It makes the pile smaller before going any further. I found that all maps fall into one of two broad categories: circular maps with the North Pole in the middle, and squarish maps with the North Pole at one of the edges or corners. But before we go any further, I ask you to consider one thing: the sense of scale that's needed when thinking about the maps of the world. I'll use one familiar layout for a moment, as that's all we need at this stage. If we take any of the circular maps with the North Pole at the middle, the world is essentially a disk with a diameter of about 25,000 miles and given an approximate surface area of about 490,000 square miles. Yes, the surface area is about 2.5 times that of the globe, but the extra is mostly oceans and ice. Going upwards, commercial aircraft are limited to 45,000 feet, or about 8.5 miles. The Concorde topped out at 11 miles. Military aircraft fly a little higher, and the International Space Station claims to orbit up to 260 miles. I'll use this map for a moment as it's one of the clearest. This little gap between Canada and Greenland is called the Davis Strait. In reality, it's 190 miles wide, so we can realistically scale 260 miles above the same map that would represent the height at which the ISS claims to orbit. If we draw the surface of the Earth to scale, this little line represents 200 miles. So the blue circle shows how high above the surface 260 miles would be. It's approximately half the width of the Davis Strait again, and shows how high the ISS flies. So the total envelope of airspace in which we are free to fly around and look at the world is this grey area. Any mapping of the world would need to be made from within this envelope. It would be like walking into a room with an extremely low ceiling and trying to see what the whole room looked like from a single standpoint, Or, more realistically, it would be like trying to see the whole room while standing in the pile of a thick carpet. It's realistically impossible. You can try the same thing yourself with any of the maps that claim to show pictures of the world, including the globe itself. Ask yourself, how high can any of us really go before we start claiming to see the whole world at a glance? Or that we can see the curvature, if you still think we live in a ball. If you look closely at all the maps you can find, you'll see rather quickly that they all show roughly the same thing. Yes, some have bits missing, like islands, or in some cases the poles themselves, and others have variously squished the sizes of certain continents to make their own bigger than others. Yes, some men really do have a thing about size, but that's not for us to worry about for now. The two main contenders in this battle are the circular maps that have the North Pole at the middle, and the square maps that have the poles at one of the edges or corners. Samuel Rowbotham is not the only person to have made a flat circular map of the world. The circular maps include Alex Gleason's map from 1892, the Hammond's Age map that was made in 1943, and of course the United Nations flag that was made in the late 1940s, and this old French map that still has New Zealand attached to Antarctica. This layout has been known for centuries. There are many others that show the same layout, and whether you agree with them or not, they all seem to show the same land masses as each other and have been proven. For all intents and purposes, they work as practical layouts. It's dishonest to continue claiming that every circular map is based on Rowbotham's work. The square maps are a little more varied, but generally show the poles at one of the edges or corners. I'll not belabour you with the magic twilight zones where the sun and the moon fall off one edge and pop up on the other, as we have no credible reason to believe that fact. And if you're serious about finding a working map, it will be disingenuous to hide behind some vague notion of a creator to support this particular flight of fancy. I'll use Alex Gleason's map as the circular layout, and I'll use Mercator's map to pattern the square maps. I'll deal with the other variations as we go along. I used Gleason's map because it's probably the cleanest circular map we have for the time being, and while Mercator's map has been variously pulled and pushed in a variety of directions, it's fairly easy to figure out what goes where. You won't have to look very far to realise that all the maps in either category have their differences. In most cases, they are small islands that are missing, and some variation in the land masses, but it's not hard to find your way around them. So what's the difference between the two? In short, Mercator's map and its variations are square or rectangular and have the poles at one of their edges or corners. The Gleason's map and its relatives are circular and have the North Pole at the middle. There really is nothing that varies outside of these broad guidelines. It's not hard to see how they relate to each other. Most of the time they are passed off as projections, and we go round in the same circular argument, getting nowhere. So let's step away from the maps for a moment. The 1950s seems to have been rather busy for those who are interested in the shape of their world. Between chucking nuclear warheads up in the sky to try and bust a way through the roof, and the various expeditions to the South Pole that resulted in a few frozen explorers, we seem to have sewn things up quite nicely by the 1960s. And by the end of the next decade, we seem to have answered the problems with the roof by telling people that we sent a few guys to the moon. There was perhaps one small wrinkle in the plan though. Kept away from the roof and the edges, the only flaw might be the North Pole. By the 1950s, it was considered to be a done deal. It had been explored several times, and aside from a few polar bears and a ton of snow, there wasn't much up there to see. Even Father Christmas had migrated to Lapland and was nicely tucked up out of the way with his elves. But the North Pole might still give the game away, especially as air travel was becoming easier. So what's so important up there that we might want to see? A cursory look at most world maps seems to suggest that there's nothing up there but water, and lots of it. Perhaps the explorers had paddled their way up there. So how did they stop anyone else sticking their noses in? Let's go back and see what they were up to. By the mid-1950s, the prevailing worry was that those pesky Russians might start lobbing missiles over the North Pole into Canada and the US, and to combat their formidable enemy, the Americans decided to build a great defence line called the Dew Line, from which they could see incoming missiles, real or imagined. The Dew Line runs from the extreme western limit of the US at the Bering Strait, across the top of Canada just below the Arctic Circle to the eastern coast, then over the Davis Strait to Greenland. A nice long line across the top of the northern hemisphere. So, to return to our mapping puzzle, where would the Dew Line be on a flat map? Any map where Canada is not facing Russia makes the Dew Line entirely pointless. In every case, it renders the square maps pointless, excepting those that use the Twilight Zone argument, which would need everyone to rely on falling off one side, missiles and all, and popping back up on the other side in the same instant. The only layout that works for a map of the world, to include the Dew Line, is to have a circular map on which Canada and Russia face each other across the North Pole. Of course, it would be dishonest if I didn't bring the globe back into the picture as an alternative layout, but it seems that the only workable layouts are on the circular maps, or it's back to the globe again. The big question for you to answer is, if the circular map and the globe show the same thing, the only difference is that one of them has a curved surface and the other is flat. People seem to recognise the similarities between them, but for some reason Antarctica seems to puzzle some who can't quite grasp how a deep circular boundary has been condensed into a single landmass. It's almost counterintuitive, so I propose an exercise that I did when I first came to Flat Earth. You can try this for yourself. I used a sheet of tin foil as it holds its shape, but you can do this with a sheet of paper just as easily. Get yourself a small football, one of those 7-inch balls is perfect, and measure the circumference. It'll be a little over 21 inches. Now get your sheet of tin foil and cut out a circle whose diameter matches the circumference of the ball, in this case about 21 inches. Get yourself a marker pen and draw the circular map with Antarctica onto the tinfoil circle. There are no points for artistic merit, but try to keep the land masses proportional. Include the equator and have Antarctica running around the edge. Once you've drawn your map out, wrap it around a ball and hey presto, you have your globe. You'll see that you really only need to scrunch up the southern hemisphere to turn a flat, circular map into a globe, and Antarctica comes together nicely as a single landmass at the bottom. The circular maps are not that much different from the globe, except that one of them is flat and the other is spherical. If you are honest with your layout, you'll see that the equator still runs around the centre of the sphere, and that most of the northern hemisphere matches any other globe. The only real difference is in the southern hemisphere, where the land masses will have been reduced a little bit, but since most of the southern hemisphere is made up of oceans, nobody could really tell the difference in real life. For what it's worth, I'm content that the Dew Line disproves all the maps that have the North Pole at one of its edges or corners. So we are really reduced to one of two models, the circular layout or the globe. You decide. And while you do so, I've got something else you might like to consider. For anyone who's seen the numerous broadcasts by the space agencies, especially NASA, you'll probably recognise this diagram. It's usually displayed at the front of the mission control room during the missions themselves. Specifically, I'd like to take a look at the ground track of the spaceship. For many years, I was content with the assertion that it showed the ground track of a rocket flying in a straight line around the Earth. But after buying a globe and tracing the path, it was fairly easy to see that the path was anything but a straight line. If you watch the track from takeoff in Florida on a globe, it flies northeast up towards Britain, then flies southeast over Europe and down under Australia before flying northeast back up to the US. What's it doing flying all the way up past England, then down to Australia? Sightseeing? You can trace that path on a globe as many times as you want. It will never project a straight line. But suppose the Earth to be flat and the circular layout is used. The standard globe model has the Earth divided north to south by 36 longitude lines. Each of them are 10 degrees apart. The meridian line is at Greenwich in London. And if we transfer the same 36 lines onto a circular map, each line runs from the North Pole to Antarctica. The equator makes a good reference point between the two models. Back in globe land, suppose we measure each point on the space shuttle's path as it crosses each line of longitude. We can then measure how far each point is from the North Pole and transfer it onto a circular map, so we are showing the same path on both maps. You'll notice that the path on the flat circular map is largely circular. It's a standard orbit or holding pattern for any intercontinental flight. I suggest that any spaceship that is claiming to be orbiting is simply flying around in circles above us. You can try this with any path over the globe. You might surprise yourself how easily they move from one map to the other. Now you can see the same path shown on a square map and on a circular map. You ask yourself which one seems the most likely. I came across that little anomaly when I first came to Flat Earth, and it was only when I stumbled upon a gentleman who was asking NASA about the wiggly flight path around the globe. The gentleman at NASA seems to have been so evasive that I thought on the problem in a little more detail. In other words, suppose for a moment that the Earth was flat and circular, would the path make more sense? Alex Gleason's map is by no means the only circular map that can be used to model a flat Earth. Anyone looking at circular flat maps can see that the layout is constant between all of them, so it's unlikely that any of them are grossly wrong. The only reason for favouring the Gleason layout is that it's a fairly clean diagram, but any individual choice is yours to make. There's one final point I'd like to make. While Antarctica seems to present enough problems in itself, especially since nobody has been down there to see it for themselves, the North Pole is suspiciously quiet. Anyone who's taken a cursory look at the matter knows that the geographic North Pole is not the same as the magnetic pole. The geographic pole is somewhere high in Greenland, and most maps of the world show the North Pole to be nothing but Arctic Ocean. Aside from some vague history of expeditions there during the last century, we don't really know much about it, but there is a clue that most of us have probably already heard but generally dismissed. I'm referring, of course, to Mount Meru. It's generally passed off as something from ancient mythology, and I thought much the same thing at first, but on closer inspection there may be more to it. The Flatwater Flat Earth channel did a wonderful programme about the Arctic Treaty, in which he managed to trace some 17th century writings between John Dee and Gerardus Mercator. Yes, the same Mercator who gave us the globe. In amongst the writings there are references to what exists up there, and a number of maps including this one. As I said a moment ago, much of this seems to have been chalked up to mythology, but a closer look reveals that the continents surrounding the North Pole are those that most of us will still recognise today. Specifically Asia, America, Greenland, and even the northern parts of Britain, Scotland and Iceland. While Mercator seems to be viewed with contempt among most flat earthers, it is worth noting that he was a cartographer by profession. I find it hard to believe that his maps of the North Pole are some figment of his imagination for a number of reasons. The magnetic lodestone, which is Mount Meru, offers a perfect explanation for the magnetic pole of the world. It is the only credible alternative to the liquid iron core that keeps shifting, so we're told that we should only use GPS to navigate. Mercator's North Pole also shows the incoming waters that rise to 4 heads that are corroborated by the biblical accounts in Genesis. Let's remember that the Bible was only translated into German, Mercator's home language, in the middle of the 16th century, and so it's unlikely that he took his rivers from that source. Given that the prime meridian now runs directly through London and Paris, you'll see that on Mercator's map it falls some 20 degrees west of its present location. It doesn't take much skill to overlay Mercator's map of the North Pole over the Gleason layout and rotate it back so that the prime meridian and the continents of Asia, now Russian territory, and America match. The net result is a more complete map of the land masses and a North Pole on a flat circular world. I've taken the liberty of retracing the layout to make a single map of the land masses and to provide a single reference that might be used until something better is created. I've also added one more inclusion from the Gleason map because I've not noticed it anywhere else. In the bottom right hand corner of his map, Alex Gleason notes that during the December solstice, when the sun is at its most southerly point, there is no sunlight beyond 80 degrees south, and so everything beyond that point is in perpetual twilight. I've shaded the map accordingly. See what you think of it. So, in closing, the dew line and the intercontinental flight paths seem to preclude any map which has North Pole at the edge or the corners. The only models that work are those which have Canada and Russia facing each other across the North Pole. The only contenders are the circular layout and the globe. That's your decision to make. It's a little late in the day for people to still be claiming that without a map, the flat Earth has no case to answer. It may well be countered with the same assertion that the globe doesn't have one either. The surface of the Earth, whichever model you choose to use, is too big for anyone to go out and map it in its entirety. For now, we will make the best we can from the information available. The world that you think you know has very much been hidden before your eyes. Globe or disk, it is limited by the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle. You're kept very much in the middle. I don't go a bundle on numerology and gematria, but that's not to say I don't find it interesting, and I'm reasonably certain that many of the hidden things in this world are hidden by people who really do put their faith in the arrangement of numbers. So, to that, let me add an observation that while many notice that the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn are at 66.6 degrees from the mapped poles, it's also worth noticing that the Arctic and Antarctic circles are at a very precise 66.33 degrees from the equator. What do numbers have to teach us about the people who gave us the globe? Thanks for listening.